Good morning, diners, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Morning Wake-Up Call here on the Doomstead Diner. And this morning, I am welcoming an old friend, a Brit from across the pond, who was my co-host on the Collapse Cafe for a couple of years, and we're gonna just shoot the shit today about a varying topics that are of interest, we hope, to the Collapseniks out there, and just have some fun. And I don't know where this conversation is really gonna go. When Monsta and I get together, it can go all over the place. And so, Monsta, welcome. It's great to see you again and be talking again here online. And how's it going over there in Great Britain?
Yeah, everything's doing great. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Oh God, it's been like ages, hasn't it? I can't remember the last time I was on recording, so it brings back old times. But yeah, going back to what you're saying, yeah, everything's good. That's what they say on the papers. Unemployment's at an all-time low. Britain's doing well. It's doing a bit better than they expected. All things considered, especially after the shitstorm that's Brexit. Sorry about my French, but yeah. So that's sort of the big headlines a lot of the time in England the past 2 years or so. But yeah, otherwise everything's cool.
Well, I'm glad you're still in good shape and still employed. I am, he made me aware of, which is good news too. And, Brexit, like you mentioned, it's been a big topic, a constant topic, and I think people in Britain are kind of tired of it and a little burned out from the whole thing. And we won't get any real action on it until Halloween, which is a great time. Find out the next episode in that adventure. But we talked a little bit beforehand about stuff we might talk about. One of the things that you are pretty conversant with, because your parents emigrated from there, is the situation in Sudan, which is one of those countries that's undergoing a lot of political turmoil. So, it's an African country, for those of you out there who don't know your globe. And there's a lot of turmoil in Africa, always. Why don't you fill us in a little bit on what's been going on in Sudan for the last couple of years?
So, I mean, the chronic problem with Sudan, and I suppose you could extend that, the chronic problem in Africa is ongoing corruption and various dictators. So the dictator, I suppose, in Sudan is a person called Bashir, and he was in power, I believe, I can't pin down the exact date, was it 1988 or 1989? One of those 2 years he's been in power. Mm-hmm. And his rise to the top as well was as a result of a military coup from a civilian government. So he's been running the roost for, pretty much 30 years, give or take. And it's just been a slow but steady decline and erosion in public services. Part of it, a few years ago, it's almost 10 years ago now, is, there was enough conflict between the North and the South. It created that division. Now we have South Sudan, which is, part of the problem. But really specifically what's happened in the last 5 years is we've had or beyond 5 years, is we've had large inflation, like double-digit inflation, 50%. So people's wages, as you know, are not really changing there. So imagine you're having half your salary cut in half every year for consecutive years. How are you going to make a living? And
buy
this
food.
thing has been riding for quite
And buy food.
some time.
I mean, they're relatively speaking, their food prices to what they can afford to buy must be, skyrocketing. And that's always a fundamental driver of, revolutions and political unrest and so forth, from relatives and so forth. What's the food situation like there?
I mean, like from what I hear, it's just difficult. Like everything, I don't like. At least from where I'm from Khartoum, which is like the capital of Sudan, and it's not as bad from what I hear as like what you can see in places like Darfur, where people are, starving. But it's difficult, like getting kids to school, hospitals, electricity, all these basic utilities are really expensive. And not only that, it's just the banking system is basically on life support because the banks are not giving money to people are not being paid, and people are moving away from bank accounts to money under the sofa. And in terms of food, people have to go to the raw basics, just, very simple things, just bread, beans, it's just very staple goods, like no meat and things. And the way it works in Sudan, to make it a bit easier, is there's more of an emphasis on extended families. So people pool their money together and they manage that way. So it's not a kind of, there's not so many nuclear families as there were. But still, despite all of these adaptations, there's, like you mentioned, there's a point where everybody breaks. And this was the year where that point finally came, and the people just went on the streets and said, we've had it.
Do you see, or do you foresee any kind of internal, like, civil war type of situation? Not just the people rising up, but then a backlash of the government and one faction, and then that's what's happened in a lot of those countries in Africa and the Middle East. Is once the big dictator is taken out of power for one reason or another, then you get a whole bunch of different factions, and everybody starts fighting amongst each other. Do you see the beginnings of that at all in Sudan yet?
It's a bit early, because the thing is, I'm not saying it will not happen, but the thing is, we're still like in a bit of an impasse, because yes, Bashir has stepped down from power, but then his cronies want to create a temporary government until they can get a permanent civilian government. But initially they're saying 2 years temporary government, which is just a ploy to be there longer. So we don't know how that's going to pan out. It could be another dictatorship. If it goes to civilian government, there's already been a past history of military coups, so that is a potential for civil war. The other thing that people are mindful of in this whole situation is there was a split between the North and the South Sudan a few years ago. All the people in the South were talking about freedom, freedom, freedom. The day they got their freedom, it turned into a big, big civil war, everyone on each other's throats. So people are afraid of this, and they also see stuff that's happened in Libya, in Iraq, and even in Egypt. Egypt is their neighbor. So, yes, there's definitely potential, and people are worried about this. So,
Yeah.
They're still on the streets. And the thing is, they're really mad because the thing that you got to remember now is this is the month of Ramadan.
Right.
So basically, everyone's fasting, but they're still on the streets.
Can I interrupt you for a second on that? A couple of things here on a technical level. First of all, you're jumping around a lot on the screen. And second, you're not in the shot. Are you on your laptop camera? I think you're not on the right camera because you're a lot blurry.
No, this is the thing. It's just because I think what's happened, like earlier in the day, it was still light and it's dark, and so the lighting has got worse.
I got it. So you're lighting, because you're a lot more jumpy, and you're low in the screen too. Can you tip it up some more, or tip it down so you are more sensitive? There you go. That's a little better. All right. Just trying to make the visuals a little better for our people that watch. And one thing I do want to remind everybody is that we don't only produce the video. If you do want to just listen to these broadcasts, we have an audio-only version that you can listen to on SoundCloud, Diner SoundCloud, or you can download it from there as an MP3 and drop it on your iPhone or whatever and listen to it while you're gardening or riding your bike or sitting in traffic on the way to work, whatever. So, you know, you can access this however you like. But a lot of people like to watch on their iPhones also, and or Samsungs like I have, and you know, see the facial expressions and body movements and my left hand waving around like it always does. My talking hand that I use on my cooking show, the Cooking Zone. At any rate, okay, back to Sudan. Now that we've gotten over that technical stuff, so yeah, they're facing a lot of problems. They may be in a civil war situation at some point in the near future. But at least at the moment, unlike Venezuela, I don't think there's any indication that the fascist states of America is going to be stepping in there to try to, you know, prop up the dictatorship. Or is there any particular faction that is being supported by the empire, the Anglo-American Empire?
I don't think they're a fan of Bashir. I mean, one of the reasons being is the Sudanese economy is under U.S. sanctions, and part of that reason that they have these sanctions in the first place is the government is considered an entity that provides a safe haven for terrorists. You know, one of the big ones that they mentioned was they had Bin Laden for a while. He was living in Sudan. So I think that's when the sanctions started. So they never really took America's advice to open up their intelligence and get these people released. So that's why the sanctions are there. So they are not very supportive of Sudan. They were very supportive of the split from the north and the south, again against Bashir. So I think the relationship is quite poor between America and the previous government Bashir. So I guess, you know, if there was any angle that they wanted to play, they would trump up the support. But I just don't think there's enough in Sudan for American interest. It's not like Iraq, where Iraq has a lot of oil or they have a lot of influence in the Middle East. I don't think there's that level. But I think basic dynamics of inflation, people reaching a breaking point, I think this is just one of the things. It's just one of the countries that you're seeing on like the collapse sphere. It just doesn't get enough press because it's not like a very influential country, but it is following the same dynamics as a lot of places, which is always, I think, where you can find interest in
one
these
thing
kind of
is,
stories.
you know, they don't. Sudan is not an oil-rich country, but because their geographical location, it's very important on a geopolitical level. I mean, I'm remembering my globe here, but it actually sits on the other side of the Straits of Hormuz from Iran, and so there's all that conflict that's going on with Iran now. Am I correct on my geography? So I don't go completely off the deep end here.
I mean, yes, it is kind of like on the other side. I'm just trying to think here. Yes, kind of in the same area. I mean, yeah, I mean, Iran's like on the other side a little bit. Like it's nearer like Syria and Afghanistan area.
Oh, right. They're both separated by the Gulf. One's in one side's Africa and the other side is the Middle East. And there's the water, and that's where all the tankers go. Is through that channel. Some go out the Straits of Hormuz, and other ones go out the Suez Canal to the north and Egypt into the Mediterranean. So they go one way or the other. And the deal here is, the fascist states of America has made a big deal about sending a new carrier group to the region, and then yet another battleship group, and are building up their armaments. Now, this is fairly constant. The U.S. military, the military-industrial complex, is always sending warships out there, but they're making more of a big deal about it this time around in the MSM, along with the sanctions against Iran that you mentioned are Sudanese problems as well, relating to terrorism and all sorts of excuses for giving out economic sanctions. And for people who are aware of history, it was economic sanctions on Japan that was the instigator for World War II, and the embargo specifically of Japan on oil imports, which was an absolute necessity for developing industrial economy. Now, Iran, on the other hand, has their own oil, but they don't depend on it for industrial infrastructure there. They depend on it for export and for forex revenues. If they can't export their oil, then they end up losing money. And when a government doesn't have money, then they start to lose power. And so there's a struggle now on that end, and there's all sorts of blustering on both sides. Do they talk in England at all that you've heard about on the Iranian question? And Britain is another member of NATO and probably the biggest supporter of the FSA, the most in line with this government's diktats. Is there much talk over there about the Iranian situation and where that might lead?
I mean, the thing is, like, on the news, it's definitely there, and but not like on the same level as other news articles. But what I would say to that is, like, definitely Trump has taken a much more hardline position with Iran, and yes, Britain is supportive of the United States, but I think from what I've seen so far, they're probably closer aligned to what the EU is saying, and their true opinion of the matter is they want to sort of maintain the relationship that was present when Obama was in power, and that is to try and not introduce more sanctions, because it's not the risk that they're seeing, I suppose, is if you just impose sanctions when people are more or less following the rules, is that you don't bring compliance. Why would a country follow the rules when they get into trouble for it? And there is a certain, connection here, because Iraq in the past complied, and then they didn't build nuclear weapons, and then look what happened to Iraq. And Iran are trying to do the same thing, like trying to, well, at least in the past, they tried to disarm to some extent their nuclear program, and they're just getting more sanctions. And the reason, I mention these things is because you look at North Korea, and North Korea is very skeptical about following the position of what America's saying. So it's all about carrot and stick here. That's what I feel. And if they use the stick too much, you're not going to get people to follow you, at least not in the long term. There has to be a little bit of honey.
Right.
Not
well, and the the thing is that on the political arm and the state arm of the FSA, they say one thing, but they do the opposite. And as far as Trumpovetsky is concerned, anything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. So nobody can trust what's going on, and that in almost all areas of politics and economics, it boils down to a matter of trust. Without that, you're just about everything is lost, and negotiations break down, and that's what we've been seeing in just about every area. We can go into the trade aspects with the Chinese there, but before we do that, we talked about how Britain is probably over in Europe the closest allied and follows the political line of the FSA most closely, and so functions in a sense as an intermediary between the FSA and Brussels, Europe as a whole, the EU. Now, how do you see the relationship with the EU going? Their ability to have influence there, what with Brexit and all that stuff. Is there much talk about EU relations? And then you're supposed to, I think, aren't you supposed to have the European Parliament elections there pretty soon?
Yeah, it's like pretty much going to happen like in 10 days or so. But I think really people just, like, the narrative definitely is you just want to be out of it. In terms of influence, I don't think people are really that bothered about having influence in Europe. It's just more about focusing on internal national issues and not ignoring the working class people. I think that's the general narrative when it comes to EU/British issues. It's like Britain needs to deal with British issues. We don't want to have influence with the EU. We just want to do our own thing. We want to control our own destiny. These are the kind of things that get promoted when we talk about Brexit. And there's no real will to try and control the EU, because to a lot of people it's a bit of a dysfunctional organization. That's how they see it, for right or wrong. That's the way it is. So I don't think people are that keen on trying to influence Germany, France, or all those other countries. It's
Right.
just not on the
Well, and
radar.
I'm not sure how much influence they could actually have either, given their own situation. I know internally, and as far as the EU is concerned, probably the biggest conflict there comes in terms of trade and how, if and when they do exit the EU, how all the trade agreements that they have will function, and then cross-border stuff is particularly up in Ireland, where they, are concerned about, people in Ireland having to, show passports essentially at border crossings all the time between, Northern Ireland and, Ireland proper, which is part of the British, the United Kingdom. So, those issues appear to be the biggest ones on the radar to me.
Yeah, I think definitely the last point that you made, like, I think the big issue is that border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Like, if they create a hard border, it would violate the peace agreement that was made between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which was like one of the things that resolved the whole terrorist attack in the IRA. So this is why it's been like a big hot topic and a pinch point with the whole negotiations with Brexit. So nobody knows how to deal with that situation in a satisfactory manner. So that's one of the most significant roadblocks that has been talked about at length in the British media. I don't know how much coverage that particular issue gets in the international news, but I think that was one of the sticking points to negotiations for this Brexit.
When Brexit was, a super hot issue a few weeks ago, and it was up in the air whether they were going to get pitched out, whether they were going to just jump out, or whether they'd capitulate, or what, and then yet another extension was granted to October. So during that time, the news here on the MSN did, feature, the various aspects of the problem, and that was, highlighted as one of the sticking points. And then, for myself, I watch, I read the internet, and then, I watched a few of the debates in Parliament on Sun live stream, and when you get to that aspect of it, I mean, there's no agreement, and there's a whole bunch of different parties involved. It's a different system in here. You don't just have two parties, although you do have two dominant ones, Labour and the Conservatives or Tories or whatever they're called, in there. But then there's a ton of other ones, and a lot of local ones, local ones to Ireland, local ones to Scotland, and so forth, that all have different ideas on the whole thing. So, just that, just to briefly before we move on from Britain, what about that conflict between Labour and the Conservatives, and specifically Theresa May, the Prime Minister, who's seems to be tremendously weakened by all this conflict? Is there any talk about her stepping down and where the party will go?
I think in terms of that, the knives are under the closet somewhat, because what Theresa May has said when this whole Brexit negotiation was hitting like what seemed to be at the time the final chapter, just prior to the breakup, is that she stated herself that once the negotiations are completed, she would step down from her role as Prime Minister.
Hang on.
So,
Hang on.
Yeah.
I got a camera that just shut down on me. Okay, pick it up. Keep going.
Okay, so what I was saying was, Theresa May did state that when the Brexit negotiations are over, that she would step down from power. So that's kind of kept the whole party at bay. So they're not challenging her.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Labour Party has sort of cooled to the idea of not doing another general election, because there was pressure by Corbyn to force another general election because he lost confidence in her ability to lead. And to be frank, at the time, I think it was almost a universal fact that she already survived a vote of no confidence. Mm-hmm. And that was even before she put her proposal for leaving the EU, which was rejected the first time by 220 votes, which is the biggest defeat in the history of Parliament. And Parliament's been there a long time, longer than the United States has been a nation, and that was the biggest defeat by a government in the history. And then she lost again by 150 votes, and then again by 80 votes. So, losing once is bad, losing on that scale is worse, but to lose 3 times, people just didn't have confidence that she had any control of what was going on in that building.
Yeah, here we call that 3 strikes and you're out, that's the baseball metaphor, I know you guys play cricket over there, so you don't have three strikes, but she was in a sticky wicket. That's what went on. Okay. Well, we covered Europe and Africa here pretty well. So I'd like to move back across the pond to my side and talk about a couple of things that are happening here that have effects and analogous problems over in jolly old England. One of great concern lately in the elections and to many young people here, of which you're a member of that generation, millennials, is the student loan problems that we have and how that's affecting our economics and the great amount of debt that has been accumulated by young people trying to get a degree and get ahead. Before we get into the way the system's organized here, how is it organized over there in terms of financing your education and loans versus grants versus free education through the quasi-socialist system? How did you get your education, for instance?
So, the thing is with the student loans here is, a lot of students, that's their main way of financing their education. And basically, I believe it's like you have to earn around 20,000 before they would start paying back your student loan. Mm-hmm. And then you pay it in increasing amounts from that starting point. And you basically got about 20 years to pay back your loan, and if it's not paid back in that time, say you never held a high-paying job for long enough, so you're part-time or whatever, the loan gets written off as a loss.
Mm-hmm. So that does not happen.
It has a finite lifespan, basically. So it's not quite as onerous as what it is in the United States, where it's never discharged, and as far as I'm aware, there are no end dates to these loans, so you pay until it's paid or you die.
Yeah.
I don't think your kids can inherit the student loan debts, but I'm pretty sure they'll probably think of that one in the near future when it hits a crisis. But
yeah, well, it actually, goes right until you're, on Social Security, in your retirement, and if you still owe money on your student loans when you're 65 or whatever, they'll start, garnishing, taking out money from your Social Security payments, and that's often the only money these folks live on, and it's not always a huge amount. In order to get the maximum Social Security, which is something like, I think, $2,500 a month or whatever, you've got to have 35 years of getting a high-paying or reasonably high-paying job in order to qualify for that. And then it reduces down from there. And so, there are just tons of people, and they talk about how the boomers had it all good and all the rest of it, but there are tons and tons of boomers out there who, made medium incomes, had some years of unemployment and so forth that are interspersed in there, and they're getting well under the maximum amount. They're getting, $1,500 or $1,400 a month, and then in many places in this country, you're paying over $1,000 a month just for like a one-bedroom apartment. And if you're, trying to maintain a mortgage, maintain the taxes on your property, if you actually own it after enough time, and the increasing cost of your utilities, I mean, there's nothing left over. And so if they start taking out of that $200 a month or something for paying a student loan, well, you're reduced to poverty basically until you die. And yeah, you're right. I don't think that the loan transfers to your kids yet. But may happen. But the whole system here, and it's not, many other loans and, business loans. Donald Trump went bankrupt God knows how many times. Henry Ford went bankrupt 5 times. But you can't discharge a student loan in bankruptcy. And so all that money, the federal government guarantees it, and so the banks don't have, it's risk-free loaning for them. And so they just keep loaning out more money, and the grand bill keeps totaling up bigger. It's over $1 trillion now, and it has many of the same features as the subprime loans did around 2008 and 2007 that caused the economy to crash at that time. How do you see the loan situation and debt situation working out both here and over there? I know that you're actually a loan officer. So, how's the loan market? How's all that going?
well, yeah. If you're talking about Britain, because I think there's 2 questions that you just mentioned there, one in the United States, one in the England. I would say in England we're probably just about reaching, well, it's difficult to say, it's hard to predict the future, but put it this way, the consumer debt is like at an all-time high in England, and savings are at an all-time low. I remember going for some training on life insurance, and they were mentioning this. People don't have any savings, and it's a very low level, and their borrowing is at an all-time high. So if there's an emergency, what's going to happen? So that's that overall trend. The second point is that interest rates are at historic lows still. Borrowing is very cheap, and Bank of England are making a lot of noises about increasing the rate. Now, they like to telegraph these things, so that's what's coming in the pipeline, and they're just telling the industry pretty much that it's just a question of how quickly it goes up. The only thing that sort of softens their position somewhat is the fact that, we've got the whole unpredictability, that's Brexit. But in the long term, this is what Carney's wanting to do. So that's going to have a negative effect. It's going to have a negative effect on mortgages. Lots of people will find their mortgages more expensive, and that takes up a significant chunk of people's incomes. I'm sure the same is true in America.
Oh, yeah.
So I think if we're not at the limit, we're getting close to the limit. And certainly if there's some sort of black swan event like peak oil or something like that, it's going to leave people in a very tight spot, because finances are very tight now. If there's anything that sort of breaks equilibrium, it's going to make things even worse. So that's my viewpoints on England. United States, with the student loan debt, it's like you said earlier, the loans are risk-free, and this is the thing that's very fundamental to any loan, is that you have to have a risk element. There's always a risk, and it's the bank's job to manage that risk, because if they don't take any of the risk involved, then they can just dish out loans in huge volumes. And the problem with that is you overheat the market, you inflate the market, and you generally produce over-investment bordering in malinvestment. Like, you can make a case that people are no longer investing in the right way. Too many people are getting degrees. People who are getting degrees are not getting degree jobs. So you have to question whether this is the right way to spending money. And at the moment, it's all unfair, because all the risk of loans breaking down is put on the student. They're taking the risk that, will they get a good job? Will they be employed? Will there be a recession? All these things that will affect their ability to pay the loan, it's all on them. There's no risk element to the bank. So it's an unfair relationship, I think. And you have to remember as well, the banks have the money, they have the people, they have the resources to predict the future to a much greater extent than the average student who goes into uni. Because let's face it, they don't know nothing. So why put all the risk on them?
Yeah, these are, for a large part of the sector is kids coming straight out of high school, okay? How much do they really know? And all they are ever sold is that they need an education if they're going to get a good job. And the only way to get said education is, at least unless they happen to be born to rich parents, is to take out loans, because the cost of the education here has utterly skyrocketed. I mean, it's, I think it's 10 times or even more than 10 times, and this is in fixed dollars, what it cost me to go to an Ivy League institution back in the 70s. And so, the costs have inflated tremendously, and part of the reason for that is because the money flows so easily out of the loan system that's all guaranteed by the federal government. And, in the end, the risk is taken, yes, it's taken at the first level by the students, but when the students end up not being able to pay and defaulting on the loan, then it transfers off the balance sheet of the bank and the student. It's no longer a liability for the bank or for the student, because the federal government guarantees it, so it becomes a liability for the federal government. And And so that then translates into the government having to raise taxes in order to pay for that liability, at least in theory. But what the federal government does do instead is borrow still more money in order to pay it, quote unquote. But the debt just inflates. It's one of many things inflating our federal deficit. And global deficits in general are all going in the same direction, going exponentially upward. And, I had a lot of other stuff that I wanted to talk about with you today, but we have gone into some pretty good detail on what's going on in Africa and what's going on in the European Union and Britain, and then student loan issues. So I think that's probably enough doom for this morning here on the Collapse Morning Update of the Doomsday Diner. So, without further ado, I want to thank my good friend Monsta for joining me here today and discussing this, and we will get back together again. And maybe we'll call it the Ari and Monsta Show or something like that. Give it its own name as we move forward in Collapse, because it's always great talking to him, and neither of us is ever at a loss for words, which is really good. All right, that's all to do. This time, until next time, here on the Collapse Morning Update of the Doomsday Diner. And come join us inside the diner for discussion of these topics and just to vent your spleen, if you like. Hasta la pasta.